Hi, my name's Jade Connor and I'm doing research on the new social nationalist politics of government debt. Government budgets are about decisions governments made on taxing and spending and what they spend on. And it can really affect every aspect of our lives, even our bodies. For example, if governments decide to spend more on good health or hospital services, governments can spend to affect the environment, on education, on the arts, better parks and infrastructure, everything really. And why are voters frustrated at governments at the moment? Well, one answer is that they're frustrated by governments being unwilling to spend enough money on these important areas like aged care or the NDIS. And did you know that the word for debt in many languages is actually very similar to the word for sin or guilt, or even the same? And David Graeber has called this situation a moral confusion where voters actually aren't sure whether it's sinful not to pay off debt or whether we're allowed to spend more on these important spending areas. But in the COVID era, we actually have a lot more debt and we can't avoid it. We also still have to spend on these important areas though. So how do governments decide which one they should do more? Well, the COVID era might be actually causing us to rethink our priorities and worry less about the government debt. In the past, to convince voters that we have to pay off debt urgently, politicians have relied on acceptance of what is called a policy paradigm. And by that I mean simple but deceptive stories that convince voters about the false urgency about paying off debt. And examples from my research include scare tactics, moral appeals to avoid financial ruin, and saying that we have to balance our budgets. Politicians compare government budgets to our household budgets, and that sort of makes sense to us because we know in our own lives we have to balance our budgets. But they're pulling the wool over our eyes because we don't realise that governments are different. Politicians even compare paying off the debt to healthy eating and dieting. But we know now that with dieting, we often actually have to eat more. For example, eat more healthy foods so that we boost our metabolism. And governments are similar in that we have to boost our productivity and invest more so that we can earn more money to actually pay off the debt. And one interesting thing is that after the GFC in 2008, many of us actually expected us to take a different view of debt. But politicians in the EU, they invented this new story which they called expansionary fiscal contraction. And the idea was that by cutting, we were supposed to give businesses more confidence and they'd invest more and we'd all solve our growth problems. But that didn't happen. And actually what it was a false story designed to convince us that we needed to cut government spending more. But in 2020, everything suddenly changed and politicians aren't really focusing on cutting spending as much, just making sure that the debt is sustainable. Our politics is becoming more social, by which I mean focus more on social spending and investment, and also more nationalist, by which I mean more defence spending, and also focusing on making more in our own countries and relying less on trade from other countries. My research is looking at the case studies of the US, UK, Canada and Australia, particularly those key points after recessions when governments have to start deciding if it's urgent to pay off debt. What we're finding is that economic circumstances do provide opportunities, but it's really up to our own leadership to create a new story, to explain to voters about why spending and investing is important, not just paying off the debt. It's really important because unnecessary, politically driven scare tactics that convince us to cut debt really urgently and really fast, it means less spending on important things like health, aged care, the environment, social issues and education. And we don't want voters to mistakenly vote against their own interest because of false arguments and scare tactics that say that we have to urgently repay debt. I'll be tweeting a lot more about public debt as my research goes on. If you'd like to know more, please follow me, and thank you very much for listening.